Hi there, I'm Bob Palmerton and welcome to StudioSense, pastel painting demos and tips. Today we're working on a pastel painting, a 9 by 12, called Parting Ways, and it's about these grasses and reeds in a swampy area in a field near my home, in fact. And it was a bright May day, very strong blue sky and great fluffy clouds. So we're going to work on that painting, and we're going to take a reference photo and we're going to learn how to hone in on a specific section of that reference photo. And then we're going to do an angular composition where we're taking sharp angles, right angles, diagonals, and forming that composition and those grasses to a pleasing focal point. So that's what we'll work on today. Our pastel surface is UART 400 grade paper, and we will tone that with a deep blue color, as you can see here. And the sky will be a toned orange, the complementary of blue, and of course the blue here in the foreground being the complementary of the orange colored grasses that we'll see. We're going to create some aerial perspective with the distance. We're going to create some sharp, bold pastel strokes in the foreground. I think it'll be a lot of fun, so stick with us. Paint along if you like and request the reference photo. And here we go. Here's my email address if you'd like to request the reference photo and paint along. So we'll start with the composition, and here I'm setting up an angular structure on the UART 400 paper. The angles just create a certain sense of excitement as well as tension in the landscape. So as you can see, I've built the horizon line at an angle to represent the declining angle of the two sets of grasses. There's the right side, which I'm sketching in now, just to block out the edge of the mass, the right side of the grasses. And then you can see I'll sketch in here the left side of the grasses, and that opening will be the pathway, if you will. The angles on the ground are representing reflections of the sky in water in the front of these grasses. I find that these angles, they not only create a sense of excitement, but they help the viewer hone in on the focal point. And the focal point in this particular composition will be just about in front of the right side of the grasses, where we'll see and we'll build the brightest amount of light in this painting. I'll continue with the angles in the front of the or in the foreground. Then we'll also play with the darks and lights, and those will create a certain sense of composition. As you can see, the rough pastel painting there on the lower right, indicating, and I really encourage you to do this, is to pick out your pastels, pick the values, and take a stab at the painting that you'd like to do, but on a smaller scale. I used regular pastel paper. It was not sanded paper to do that image on the right. And it provides a really good guide and reference to the pastels that I'd like to use in the final painting. Here I'm just kind of roughly kind of conveying the direction of the grasses, and we'll vary those a lot. Nature is very chaotic, right? So a lot of the grasses will go in different directions. Some of the stalks will be broken, and with those different angles of the stalks, they'll pick up different amounts of sunlight. So this is basically just a rough conveyance of the grasses in the painting. And think about when you find a scene that you want to paint, think about what it is about that scene that encourages you. By the way, the X that I'm putting here is going to be the focal area. I broke up the sketch into thirds horizontally, thirds vertically, and I do a diagonal dashed line, and that helps me define that focal length, focal point. So we'll sketch this on UART paper, and then I'll get into an acrylic and a watercolor underpainting with using dark blues that'll contrast real nicely with the orange grasses and the deep the dark blues would be really effective in the dark shaded areas where we saw really browns and very deep orange. The grasses themselves are a lighter orange, so we'll use a lighter blue, white blue type of color. And the distance tree line at the end of the pathway will be like an alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue combination. This is now the UART paper. So before, when I had sketched the composition, I was sketching it on a small piece of paper. Now I'm relaying the rough sketch, and I'm using a pastel pencil, which is generally the color of the grasses and most of the scene, which is a deep orange color. And I'll use that to, again, sketch what I've sketched on the smaller version. Again, be mindful of, I don't want to break my landscape or my canvas here in half. I want to adhere to those thirds rules that I like to use and the angles. So I'll just roughly sketch out the outlines, and then we'll get into the acrylic underpainting. Notice that I'm softly sketching the outlines of the main masses. I'll use dotted lines and just a very light touch of the pastel pencil. I will spray a fixative on this to keep it firm on the canvas and then apply the paints. Otherwise, the paint will kind of mix in with the pastel, so we don't want that uh, to happen. So it's a very simple sketch with the acrylics. So here's the deep blue acrylic, and the darkest area of the landscape is in the foreground. The sun was coming from the right side of the landscape, and it was pretty much hitting the upper portions of the tall grasses. So the area in front of the tall grasses was very dark, very deep mauves and browns, and very dark orange. So I felt that a deep blue acrylic would come in handy here. Will help those orange colors pop a bit when once the orange pastels are applied. So I'm using obviously the complementary color of orange in applying this deep blue acrylic. As you've worked with acrylic, you've got to keep it wet, otherwise it'll dry up pretty quickly. And so I use a little spray bottle of water just to spray that onto the acrylic that I paint that I've put out on my palette. And this brush is an old brush that is getting kind of stiff. I might have to actually replace it at some point. But my point here is just to cover all of the surface of the UART paper. I'll do acrylic for the main areas, the grasses. For the sky, I'll show you a little bit of a watercolor um, underpainting that I've applied. The sky being in this particular case, the lightest portion of the landscape. So I don't want to mar it with any kind of heavy paint like an acrylic. So I find the acrylic to be really handy in dark and mid value areas. And again, you could work with lighter acrylic colors, of course, in lighter value areas. This blue is very much of a lighter blue for the lighter orange grasses. So I'll continue to apply that in the direction, generally speaking, of the direction where the grasses are headed. And I'll handle this on both sides, and then I'll work the pathway in the middle. And the pathway in the middle, where the masses of grasses part, is an alizarin crimson combined with some ultramarine blue acrylic. And what you'll see there is a very deep, dark color. And that'll help really build the contrast that we'll see, the contrast of light between the distant tree line at the end of the pathway and the bright grasses. Here I'm just kind of creating some of the structure, the shapes that we'll see on the ground, where we'll get some reflections from the sky, and that'll be even a lighter bluish white that I'll apply in acrylic here. Some of the acrylic was a little bumpy when I wrapped that up, and here's just a placeholder for the lighter portions of the grasses, and then I'll apply the same. We'll call it the placeholder again, lighter blue for the areas that'll be reflected by sunlight. But sometimes the texture of the acrylic will be thick and impasto, and you could have a little difficulty applying pastel to that. Sometimes that makes it pretty interesting, exciting to have that additional dimension in a pastel painting. So you'll see that there's a piece that did kind of protrude where the focal point is in some of this light color that I've applied here, and we were able to work around that, and actually it turned out to be an interesting feature of the finished painting. So in this painting, we're using the underpainting as a complementary color to the main colors, the oranges, if you will, of the final painting. Sometimes you could use the underpainting just to kind of enhance the color of pastel that would be applied to top of it. Or you could take certain types of underpaintings and you could do an underpainting of the pastel, for example, with an alcohol wash, just to create dark areas that I find handy. If you have a really dark section of a landscape, to apply a dark pastel and then wash that up with isopropyl alcohol to get a good covering on the surface. There's your alizarin crimson with the ultramarine blue to represent that distant tree line, which we'll start working up in a little bit. And then finally, I normally don't like to do a an underpainting on the sky. In this case, I chose to because I had a fair amount of cloud structure I wanted to build. And what I've found interesting to use for sky underpainting is a light orange or a pinkish color to be behind the clouds to help warm them up, but also it works pretty well with the blue of the sky. Here I'm applying some of those whites, very light acrylic to again set the placeholders for the areas that'll be the focal point. And you see that little curve of white there. That's the piece that ended up drying up on the uh, on the surface and gave it that additional dimension, which we'll see throughout this demo as I'm adding the pastels. The watercolor, as you know, the watercolor dries lighter after it's applied. So I stuck with an orange watercolor for the sky, and then I'll go over it a bit, especially at the top part of the sky, which is a darker blue, with another coating of the orange watercolor. And it took after the watercolor, the acrylic dried pretty quickly. It was pretty much dry by the time I started applying this watercolor underpainting. The watercolor will take a little bit longer, so you got to take a break and head off, grab another cup of coffee, and things are dried up by then, so then you can start applying the pastel. So there's the basic underpainting for this pastel. Now I want to explain the right and the left here. The left is the actual photo. Notice how the horizon is about at the halfway point, and I'd rather not go that way. And I really wanted to get a different perspective on the photo that I took. So I cropped the photo on the, which is you can see on the right, and I've um, focused in or honed in, zoomed in, if you will, the to the landscape to make it more interesting and more complete. I think the if I had done a painting of the one on the left, it'd be too much of a just a I don't know a cliche kind of a painting, like a travel photo. So I wanted to make a more interesting perspective. So that's why I chose the one on the right. So We're going to work the pastels. I'm going to work the sky first, and then we're going to get into the dark values and work through the different the mid values and the lights, and we're going to cover the entire surface with pastel, clear up a lot of that acrylic and watercolor underpainting. It's nice to have some of it show through at certain points. That helps the pastel to pop in color when it's a complementary. But sometimes you'll find that you may do an underpainting and it's totally covered up, and you wonder why did I even do that underpainting? Well, first of all, painting is fun, right? I think it's the process that we really enjoy in doing these paintings. But otherwise, it also helps us define, okay, where are the major masses, where are the major darks and the major lights. So there's benefits to underpainting, and it's kind of an exciting preliminary stage of creating any pastel painting. All right, now that the underpainting is dry, we'll start working the pastels. I'll start with the sky. I've got a mid-value blue pastel I'm applying across the top. And I'll bring in lighter blue pastel to represent the lower portions of the sky that's visible on this landscape. Really rough, use the side of the pastel, rough it through. I tend to, if I want to bring a little green in here, sometimes you see that green blue in the sky. I'll apply the pastel in a slightly different direction to help blend that in. And I like to kind of show some of that watercolor underpainting there so you can see a little bit of the orange color. This is a lighter blue pastel. Now again, I'll wipe that across the scene using the side of the pastel to get that pastel surface covered, and we'll then blend that because you want a really a you don't want to see that delineation between the dark and the lighter blues. You really want to kind of see a smooth gradation of value of the blue sky from below going up toward the top or the horizon. In this particular case, I felt that I could put the blue down first, and then I'm going to work the clouds. So the clouds, they are pretty horizontal to the composition with a slight edge downward. And at the toward the end of the painting, you'll see me create a higher edge on the left where the clouds kind of come from the upper corner of the painting. And that was to create an opposite impact on the diagonals compared to the direction of the grasses, which are going from the upper right down toward the left and finishing up at the third point, if you will, the top third, almost at the half point of the pastel surface on the left. So again, this is creating some drama with clouds going in a different direction and the grasses going the other direction. I'll usually with the clouds I'll use it's not white. I've not used white in the clouds here. It's a very light pink. Got some light orange in here, and then for the darker portions of the clouds, I'll use kind of like a light purple, which and a purple is kind of like a purple gray pastel. Again, the clouds are pretty smooth, so I'll do some blending with my fingers. And I want to be careful that I don't blend orange into the sky. Although toward the end of the painting, I will take some very light orange and push that back up into the clouds to create some balance of the color in the painting. I like to take a color that I've used in one part of the painting and put it in another part of the painting as long as it works okay to do that. The distance here, the tree line, as you can see in the photograph, in the reference photo, really dark green. There was some yellow orange green, but again, a deep value in the distance. So we want to throw in similar value colors, but a couple of different colors in there to indicate certainly the dimensions of the trees that are in the background, and we're not going to have much detail back there at all. So it's really just going to be a bit of color and some a little slight variations in the values, and also the point where we'll identify the point where the remember the path itself ends, and right now it looks like it's all just the same background. So we'll get a little horizon there for the edge of the path at the end of the grasses, which will help distinguish the tree line from the path itself. And we'll use values with that. The path itself was a bit lighter in value than the tree line. So you want to kind of squint and look at your reference photo and identify how the values change with the distance and convey the values on the painting that way. The foreground, again being dark, I liked to play with purples and dark blues. So I've got a purple pastel that I've just used here, and the the shade, when you look at the grasses, much of the grasses are the shapes and the the grasses themselves are defined by the shade behind them. So what I mean by that is that you've got gaps in these both sets of grasses, and by building the gaps, and I'll use the long edge of the pastel going in a vertical direction when I do the grasses, horizontal now, just to kind of get some of uh, the ground in here, because remember the grasses are sitting on top of the ground, so the ground's got to get down here first. Um, we could work around it too once we get grasses down there, but we prefer to get it down here first. We're going to have vertical strokes of shade in the clumps of the grasses on both on the right and the left side. And then we're going to have to show grasses in the shade, so we'll play around with values to be able to convey those. Finally, I'm bringing orange into the painting. And usually at this point, you kind of like to get the pastel covered all over the entire surface. So again, I'll use the side of the pastel. I'll use dark orange, almost like a dark brown orange. The lower portions of the painting, the lower half of the paintings, of course, more in shade, and the lower half of the grasses themselves. There's a lot of they're capturing a lot of light. In the middle portion of the grasses up to the tops, so we'll want to convey that too. It's important to avoid repetition in the grasses. You'll find that many artists will, when you find a change you want to make, for some reason, and I don't understand why it is, we tend to want to repeat it. Sometimes maybe just down in the same area of the painting or on an opposite side of the painting, and then you look at it, you stand back and you look at it, and say, that's over there. That's just a repetition. It's a rock or it's a stick or something like that. But I've done it in two places, especially if they're close to each other. Then you've got to rethink that. So the grasses, they go in several different directions. Mostly they're angled toward the left. You want to look at, first of all, what you're painting, what types of grasses they are, what do they look like close up, and if you've got a digital image that you're working from, and if you request the reference photo, you could hone in on your computer and really look at the details behind it. But you want to look at the direction that they're headed, and that there will be others that will be in opposite directions, broken stalks. So you want to get all that in there. And here we're really just roughly covering up the blue acrylic, not getting into any detail at this point, mostly using the sides of the pastels, and being that they're grasses that are tall and they're vertical, we're generally using the vertical strokes of the pastel in the direction of the grasses. I had saturated this reference photo. So on your computer, you could take a digital photo and you could saturate the color just to see what's showing up there that did not show up on the standard, if you will, the photograph. And you'll find that some colors show up that you didn't really expect, but also that you could get colors that are a bit gaudy. So you got to be careful there too. I decided in this painting to make really vibrant oranges. I just thought it'd be fun. They're a little more pronounced, probably a lot more pronounced than the actual scene. But it was such a bright day in May that the stalks really jumped out at you, especially where the sun was hitting them and then they had shade behind them. Looking at the stalks and the bunches of stalks, the edges are slightly darker, so you can see the tips of these grasses are a little darker orange, and the but just below them, and I would say if I were to measure, it was probably about a foot below the top or the tips of the grasses was the brightest spot of the grasses where they were catching the sun. And then the value declined again and dropped a bit and got a little darker as you got back working back down toward the base. So at this point, we're starting to bring in the impacts of the lighting, the sun shining directly on these grasses from the right, sort of like from the lower right corner of the canvas. That's where the sun's coming from. And it's crossing the grasses, and it's going to hit the clouds too, which will show with some greater highlights. The blending part here, I'm using a palette knife. I like to use the palette knife because it does push the color into the pastel surface. It doesn't pick it up and wipe it out. You'll find the tortillons tend to do that, or some other type of sponge type products that you might use, other tools that you might use to do some blending. So this works pretty well. And given that there is going to be a gradation of the values on the grasses. So we want to get some of that blending in there of the light versus the dark. That'll create somewhat of a middle ground, middle type value at this point. So the palette knife comes in really handy. I use it a lot. I also use Soft Tools, which is the product of Pan Pastel, and those come in handy to do some blending, especially if you want to get blocks of color, blocks of pastel. They have some really good, pretty wide type sponges that could pick up the pastel from the pan, and you could cover a big surface with just a couple of strokes. And that becomes a really handy underpainting for layering on then further pastel, especially if you're using pastel sticks like I predominantly do. You can see now the some of the highlights on the ground. There's that little curved kind of whitish area at our focal point. So by bringing in some of these highlights from the reflections of the water, or reflections of the sky in these puddles of water at these grasses, I'm able now to begin to see where I could start visualizing some of the contrast of this painting. And I'll keep building on that contrast. If you'll see that I've got some darker values that'll envelop around the light highlights. I like the colors, and remember we had that nice blue underpainting, so I want to bring that blue back here for the water reflecting the sky and the contrast that it provides along the orange edges. So just look at that color, and it just feels so exciting in this particular rather dramatic kind of a composition with the grasses um, edging out and gracefully kind of bending over as they are. The contrasts are important again. So with that direct sunlight, we're able to build even darker shaded areas and create a sense of excitement here. So this is a very dark, um, like a dark purple, red purple pastel. These are all soft pastels that I'm using, and and the left side in the reference photo has more dark shaded areas than the right side. And again, they correspond with a lot of the darkness that you see on the ground in front of the grasses in the foreground. Notice there's a line of light on the grasses, especially on the left side, the left clump of grasses. And we'll kind of work that up a little further. I like to use lines in the paintings as part of the composition, and having lines meet each other and kind of curve around. By the way, this is one of the soft tools I'm using from Pan Pastels, just to kind of blend in some of the shaded areas. But the lines will be important in this painting because they'll be used to draw the attention of the viewer toward the focal point. So think about and lines could be the structure of the landscape, it could be a log, it could be a row of grasses, for example, or it simply could be bouncing light bouncing across the landscape. And you also have the opportunity to build lines and curves. When you say lines, I'm not really talking that they have to be straight. They could be curved, but they could draw the attention of the viewer to wherever you want the viewer to see. At the end of this painting, one of the last items that we'll do, and we'll talk about that when we get there, is we're actually going to create a curved line from the upper right area where the edge of the clouds hits the grasses, down through the grasses and down through the foreground, curving from like up in the center down toward the right and then curved toward the center bottom of the canvas. And that kind of envelops the scene, right? It kind of frames the scene to just create another piece of interest in the landscape. Often, a student will ask me, like, how do you know which part of the painting to work on? And I kind of like to work on the whole painting at once, I guess, maybe that's a cop out kind of an answer, but you'll find that by keeping the entire canvas available to you to update during a painting session, you begin to use the same colors throughout the painting in different spots. And that does create nice balance, just like this blue pastel I'm applying here on the left, but I also applied it to the pathway. So really just layering on colors back and forth and thinking about where the light is creeping into the clumps of grasses, and what else I could do to um, start building really the level of detail here. There are a lot of sharp strokes in this painting, and I try not to get into much detail at all. The grasses themselves had further growth at the tips, kind of like little flags, if you will. So I put that kind of detail in here, but outside of that, and outside of detailing grasses here and there, it's not a whole lot of detail in the painting. It's largely pastel strokes, wide strokes, and just bold strokes, and some bold colors. The edges of the grasses, as I mentioned, the tips of the grasses are a little darker orange. So I'll begin to bring pastel pencils into this work. I've got some dark orange pastel pencils, so they came in handy to build the edges. But you want to be careful about how the edges show against the horizon. So we know that I couldn't make the edges of the grasses the same value as the sky. You'll obviously lose them. You wouldn't really see them very well. So, and you could play with different color temperatures, but I felt that I needed a little more value, a little more darker value at the edge of the grasses, and they looked that way too in the photograph when you look carefully. So you want to get a little more darkness toward the top of the grasses to be able to see them reasonably well against the blue sky because the values are very close between the grasses and the blue part of the sky, not the white part or the clouded part of the sky. Don't forget that given that we're doing grasses that are vertical, you can't forget the horizontal stuff. And there's a lot of that in the reference photo, just lying on the dark foreground, grasses that have been stepped on and the between the weather and the wind and deer, the grasses simply get flattened out, and you need to kind of convey that in here too. There's my soft tools, doing some blending. I'll do more blending in the beginning here than I will at the end. Well, we're probably about in the middle of the painting right now. That that toward the end, we really want to see specific pastel strokes and dots and blotches, if you will, to bring out the topmost layer of the pastel in the painting. When I blend and when I make changes, I want to be mindful of where I don't want the viewer's eye to go. So, not that we want the viewer not to see that part of the painting, but we want so there's a purpose of a painting. Like, they ask you the question, why did you paint this scene? And the other point is, well, what do you want the viewer to see and hone in on and to feel good about, to really find exciting about this particular scene? So, so you'll find some areas that are just not defined well at all. Just some dark value, color, something that doesn't lend itself to much perspective or detail, and you kind of ignore. You see it, but you don't linger there. Your eye does not stick to that spot of the landscape. Really, if you want the eye to kind of go to certain areas of the landscape, and in this particular painting, we'll look at the lightest spots of the painting right now. So you can see the right side of the grasses; those are kind of bright, but they kind of edge down angularly down toward that whitish spot in the sun reflection and the water, really where the grasses part, and then they kind of carry along the reflection in front in the foreground, that whitish blue area. So it's pretty much that's where I want the viewer to see. I want the viewer to kind of come up from the, we'll call it the lower left of the painting, up into that bright area down in the foreground and look up at the grasses. And that's where I felt I'd like to get that emphasis. So when I make changes like this, even with this soft tool that I'm using, I'm dampening some of the values and I'm directing some of the color or some of the value in such a way that'll help that viewer get to that spot in that painting that I want them to focus on. And most of my work is done out in the field with photography. So I'll take my camera, I'll go hiking or skiing, and I'll find a scene, I'll take photos and bring them all back to the studio, throw them on my computer and run through them. And what I'll do is go through each photograph and then we'll identify which photos are representative of a potential painting. And what we'll do here is then take those photos and isolate them so we can work on them some other day, but then define what it is about those particular photos and those scenes that we want to build a story about regarding some of these paintings. So that's the process. And many times when you take photos of a landscape, you've taken a grand photo of a large scene and and you can kind of get lost in, well, what was it that I wanted to convey, or are there masses in the scene that could be confusing in a painting and distracting? And so you'll want to take your digital photo, look at it, and then you'll get into the process of sketching out what you want to include and what you want to exclude from the painting, and what it is about that photo that you want to convey in a more emphatic sense in the pastel. The camera and the zoom lens allows you to kind of create what artists would do would be like, such as using a viewfinder, and the viewfinder will help define the specific areas of a landscape that you want to end up painting. But the zoom lens will also do the same thing pretty much on a camera. But don't forget that when you typically when I photograph a scene, I will not um, I will not do a zoom. I'll just pick up the whole scene simply because I could zoom it on my computer and decide which areas I want to emphasize. Here I'm using a mid-value yellow brown pastel. Although I like the magentas and the blues in the ground, we got to be realistic too, in the fact that the ground does not have uh, such colors as you would think. So you've got to bring some other more realistic color into here. Now you can be certainly creative in your color choices, as we say. In art, you get the value right, and you could do any color you want, and it could be a very pleasing painting. But I want a sense of realism in here too. So I'll bring some of this yellow brown mid value uh, pastel. This is a Great American Artworks pastel into the painting to help. It'll help mute some of the bolder colors here and give it a little more of a realistic touch. You can see a lot of the grasses that I've applied horizontally on the ground with even a slightly lighter pastel. We'll work over those too. We'll be bringing in some vertical grasses soon. In the foreground, as you can see here, I'm using this is a harder orange pastel. I think it's a new pastel from years ago from my collection. And I'm starting to put the basis of some of the lines that I talked about before in drawing the viewer's attention along certain structures of the landscape. And here it could be along the tips of those grasses and up into the tall grasses in the background. Again, that should repeat to some extent in other areas of the painting too. It's very easy to ignore a part of the painting and realize later on that we forgot to put the same weeds that are over on the right on the left, because that's most likely that they were there, or rocks or whatever. So another reason why you want to work the entire painting at the same time. Here I'm building a little more contrast now. So we've got the path back there, but we also have the very light grasses picking up the sun. Now, I'm not going to leave it like that. And this is actually, I believe it's a black pastel. So the big question is, should artists use black? And I use black uh, often as part of an underpainting of a very dark shaded area, but then I'll apply a color on top of it. So, for example, I'm working on a painting and it's got large rocks in them, and there's a very shaded underside of the rock, and I'll throw black in there. But then on top of that, I'll apply like a blue gray, for example, or like a moldy kind of a dark green color, which is the underside of the rock. So I'll apply that over the black, and so the black goes away, but the value impact is very effective. You get a very still get a very dark view. So with this dark that I just added here for some of the shaded areas, I'll mute those. I'll use some of my pastel soft tools, and often I'll take, let's say it might be a very deep red brown, and I'll scumble that over the black a bit too, so that you still get the nice shaded impact of it, but it's not uh, a flat, extreme type black color. Now, mud is an enemy of the pastelist. Mud is created by often putting too many colors on one spot. Sometimes putting a dark over a light, or just simply pulling together complementary colors and mixing them, and you get kind of a muted, kind of a grayish, muddy color. When that happens, sometimes it's just more useful to get a light paintbrush, and brush that out of the area and go back and redo it with the bold color. Sometimes it's okay to leave it there as long as you can get more layers on top of it with some more, let's say, more brighter or more intense hues. The lighting that these grasses are picking up is a sort of a muted lighting, so it's somewhat blended as a mid orange value, but I'm highlighting it also and highlighting specific grasses with a lighter orange because the light is going to emanate right down toward the ground, but it's going to have a light cast to it, as you can see at the base of those grasses that I just put in, and contrasts pretty nicely with the darker ground. I'll kind of work this same color here and same value because you're going to want work again. We're working the entire canvas, and there is going to be repetition with these grasses in certain areas. There's no reason to believe in this photo that there'd be grasses in one spot that are not similar in some sense to on another spot. Here I'm taking my contrast play here and I'm applying some of the complementary blue of the water behind the grasses. I think that provides a very interesting impact to the scene, and quite a pleasing juxtaposition of color. Believe it or not, there was actually green in this um, reference photo. There were grasses, green grasses, long flat green grasses lying across the ground. We'll bring a little bit of that in here, but I didn't want too much of it because it would just make it seem a little bit unrealistic, especially if it were a bright green. So there'll be some deep value greens that I'll apply in the grasses too, and I think that provides some nice harmony or nice balance to the colors with the reds and the greens. A little bit of contrast there too, as opposed to the blue and the orange contrast that I've applied so far. So all this activity is not only creating the contrast of the lights and the darks, but continuing to build the framework to take the viewer's vision toward the focal point, to work along those angles and the lines of light toward that focal point. As I mentioned before, the left side of the grasses have a line of light which is pretty horizontal to the ground, just the way the sun was capturing a portion of the grasses. So I decided to put this in here, and it lended itself nicely toward keeping the both sides of the grasses nicely balanced. And I thought it was a kind of a fun part to do. So here I'm using it's actually a light blue hard pastel to bring in some of those lighter values areas uh, the lighter line area of the grasses. At this point, I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to that reference photo. You use the reference photo certainly to get started, to look at the details of the landscape, just to know what you're painting, to look at how the shapes relate to each other and how they reflect light or how they catch the light. But then you kind of go away from the photo and you stop looking at it because at this point it's your own creativity that's creating, building what you want to convey in the story that you want to tell in this painting. The grasses had to have more dimension, and that's why I'm adding this kind of like this vanishing point at the edge. Notice that the path has been a little better defined with that light blue, and there's a little bit of a light green in the foreground too. And we'll work on that a little bit further, but I had to continue the grasses toward the back of that path. So in a little bit, I'll also add some more lighter value orange toward the end, and that'll kind of contrast nicely with the dark tree line, showing a little more detail, a little more grasses in here. With again, it was a light bluish uh, pastel. Notice the gap there on the left. You can't see very much in there, but we know that there's grasses in there too. So we'll have to pick up a little darker value to apply to that into that area. This pastel is actually, it's not a light blue, it's more of a light pinkish orange color that I don't know where I got it from, but it was dirty and I had to clean it to see what it really was. So I don't think I've used it in a while. The path itself had grasses that were horizontal also at the base of the row of grasses. So I had to convey that. And then in a bit, we'll put that distant um, edge to the grasses that's closer to that tree line and the end of the path. The tops of the tree line in the back, actually, that's the blue, um, that's that dark alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue acrylic back there. So there's some of the acrylic is still showing through the pastel surface. I'll end up covering that up in a bit. I kind of liked the way it looked as is, but then felt that it actually could be conveyed as an unfinished portion of the painting. So I wanted to take care of that, but not really lose its character. So I'll apply a dark green back there as indicating part of the tree line. And the clouds themselves, I'm going to bring those down a bit further, um, closer to the edge of the grasses on the right side of the painting. Building a little more contrast to that line by adding some mid-value purple in the grasses, and that's kind of helping to shape the more luminous areas. This is a blue pastel doing the same, having the same impact. Think about practice with different colors. When you look at grasses, they're basically beige and yellowish and orange, but But try different colors in there and see what happens. You can always cover them up with the what we call the proper color of the grasses, but the 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 distance I talked about it, atmospheric impacts is that the distance is a little bluer, right? You lose your yellows in the distance. You got more purples and blues in the distance. Um, Blue lasts the longest of any of the colors in terms of the distance of the horizon. So it doesn't hurt to have some bluishness in certain areas of the painting. In this particular case, it's actually more in the foreground, and you could kind of think of it as being a little not foggy, but more atmospheric, if you will. Um, but we're not going to overdo that here because it's probably not quite characteristic. And this particular day was a very bright day. So we're going to use the blue more so to indicate more of a more indirect light, more of a shaded area in those grasses. And then we'll overlay some more grasses there on the top on the right side. Here's the darker orange pastel pencil that I use to indicate the tops in a varied way, not too consistently, the tops of those grasses. We run the risk of doing too much drawing here because we are dealing with grasses. So we don't really want to be too emphatic in drawing all of them, obviously, or even many of them. But we just want to pull out certain sections. And here we're kind of bringing some of that mid-value orange pastel down over those blues that we just applied along the grasses. The tips of the grasses are rather thin, well, all the grasses are thin, but when you think about it in the distance, when you've got these grasses up against a horizon line, they're going to look very thin, or they should be thin. So what comes in handy is that you'll see later I'll apply some of that, again, some of the um, plastic pastel or palette knife and the pastel pencil to create that soft, thin stalk look against the horizon and the grasses. I have a preference for a dark purple in many of my paintings in the shaded areas, and it looks really interesting against green. Purple looks really cool against green, and it just adds a very interesting characteristic to the painting. So you can kind of see how there's the mid-value stalks, lighter valued stalks, especially in the lower portion, lower right. Look at the lower right section of the painting. You can see them going in different directions. You know they're there. You don't see them all of them very specifically, but you could just figure, yes, there are grasses down there. This is a very light orange pastel pencil that's going to help build that gradation of value on those grasses. And they kind of, by doing this, I kind of lost some of those highlights. But I've saved some of my highlighted or brightest pastels for the end, and I'll apply some of that across here. Again, using the same stick, though, you could apply that because it looks very bright against the darker values. You could use some of that here and also down below in throwing some of those stalks in various areas of the foreground. you want that variety. You want the mix up of the grasses and broken grasses going in different directions and etc. Down at this portion, I found it interesting how the stalks were kind of bent over and kind of crept up along the big mass of grasses here. So I wanted to highlight those a bit, and then also bring some of the lighter values out to the distance on the right. Some of those grasses come out too. Again, horizontally on the ground, they're a deeper value, so that's why I blended that one in a bit, or bunched up a bit. I've also used charcoal, um, uh, a I think it's a willow stick, I think a willow charcoal, and that um, is a nice tool to use, even though it does dampen the color, but it does help mute. It does help mute colors. So if you need like a distant red, for example, you can't have it too bright red, so you want to mute it a bit with charcoal. That works just as a green pastel would do of the same value. So I'll do some of that too. I'm not trying to use too much of it because it is a dark gray, black type of color, and I'd rather use the nice pure colors of pastel. A little more detail on the path to help better define that path. And there's more purple. That's a purple pastel pencil. And like a little bit of purple with a little extra red in it actually. Don't forget to go horizontal and vertical. Vertical and horizontal because there's a lot of vertical lines in here. You'll want to step back and look at your painting. Have space in your studio wherever you're painting just to step back and take a look at it, and you'll find often that you'll come up with a new idea or something to change. It could be the smallest item to change. When you're close to finishing a painting, you'll realize that you've made fewer and fewer adjustments after going back and forth and looking at the painting and thinking about what to do next. So when you get to the point when you're making fewer and fewer adjustments, I think you're pretty much close to finishing the painting, and that's usually how I know when I'm done with the painting. But I'll always stand back and look at it and think about what I want to do next. And I'll look for the patterns in the painting and see which ones I want to emphasize or which spot I want to add, spot of sunlight, for example, on a certain spot of the part of the painting that I want to throw in there to add emphasis. This is I'd probably call this somewhat of a complicated landscape given the nuances of the shadows of the grasses, the highlights of the grasses, the dark areas, the direction of the grasses, the potential com- complication of just painting a lot of grasses. So when you look at a landscape, look at the masses that are in the landscape and ask yourself if I were to put that on a pastel paper and grab my valuable pastels and started doing this painting, would I be happier? How would I deal with this particular area? A good case in point is a large green grassy field. If you had that in your picture, would you be happy with painting this huge grassy field? And that's where composition and honing in and focusing becomes really important, as well as how to deal with a large block of green grass and what will it do for the painting, and are there ways to convey that block of grass that would be interesting, useful, would still make it an interesting painting. So think about that. One thing that could be a turn off of this particular reference photo is all these grasses. So what was fun about this is to build that interplay of lighting, and get that sunlight to bring the viewer's eye along through the reflections of the water up through the grasses and the line on the grasses, on the tall grasses, and the grasses there at the parting path there on the left, which are the brightest value grasses. To play around with that, to embellish it, and to create a sense of chaos, yet excitement in this particular very simple subject, but could very well be a very complicated type of painting to do. The sides of the pastel become really handy when you're doing grasses. So bringing on some of those lighter value oranges here. Notice the how there's sort of like an island of grasses there in the middle. I didn't want to create it too much of a row of grasses, but I just wanted to vary, throw a grass in here and there. Nothing is lined up here. Nothing is straight and narrow. It's all kind of like in flux. And I'm sure this particular scene looked quite different after a stormy day that followed a couple of days later. So I was kind of fortunate to run into this particular scene when I did. I have more orange pastel pencils than any other color in my set, so they came in handy in this example. Still working that edge again. So there's a front edge to the grasses on the right, but then they travel out along the path. So you'll see what we're gonna start building that row out that way. This is the one of my favorite parts of this painting is this highlighted orange grass or two or three on that little island there. And again, bringing or repeating it, but balancing it out similarly on that side because the sun, the way it kind of crept into that area, was able to highlight those certain sections of the foreground or the area right before the grasses. The thought process here is to build some rough lines of light, either with the tips of these grasses, as you could see them, even highlighting some of those the tips of the grasses more so than before to give them some emphasis. If you end up with a spot that's kind of solid when you've got all these grasses, then you know there's something not right because there really is a lot of vegetation in here with these grasses. So they were throughout the whole scene. So a solid spot, like a solid orange area, is not correct. It's not technically correct in the painting. There has to be something in there. And in this particular case, we'll throw in a few more grasses in here, but we'll bring a darker value into that dark area. And similarly, that dark orange area to the right, but still on this left clump of grasses, we'd have to build a little bit of dimension in there too with some darker value orange. You'll find that you favor certain pastels, and when you get to that point, you like to play around with the same pastel and see what you can do throughout the throughout the painting. So in this particular case, I really did like this pastel. It was a light orange, kind of a bland orange. Though it was not very strong orange. It was somewhat muted, but a light like this is that same light pinkish orange pastel I had mentioned earlier. But I found that it had a nice impact on creating that glowing light effect from the sunlight. So I like that kind of impact. And again, kind of building those lit areas to kind of draw your attention to that center point. Um, it certainly comes in handy. I mentioned earlier about taking some of my lightest pastels, and I want to bring some more highlights into the clouds. And this is a slight orange white pastel. So I wanted to get that into the cloud structure and also get that same color into the grasses. And we've got some of that already in the grasses, especially the lighter portions of the grasses. Pressing harder on the pastel will give it a stronger finish on the pastel paper. You can certainly see compared to the reference photo that the painting is a lot brighter and richer in color. And the reference photo, in fact, is saturated. So I don't lighten my photos. I'll leave them pretty much the same, unless if I want to lighten them to see what's in the dark or what didn't show up in the photograph. But I'll typically not lighten them, but I will saturate them. There's some of that blue purple pastel I'm using for some of the gaps in the grasses. That's actually a very deep blue pastel. I'm recording this video post, or obviously um, recording over the video itself, a voiceover, and I can almost kind of anticipate what my next pastel stroke's going to be. With a lot of the lights in the painting now, I like to build a little more contrast, so I'll grab a dark pastel like I just did, and definitely soften it up because it did look pretty sharp with the pastel knife. If you ever think that I can't get a light enough color value on a particular spot, just take a darker value around it, and that'll help lighten up that spot. So it looks like you even have a lighter pastel than you actually did. The pastel or the palette knife came in handy with the direction of the grasses too. So you could push that knife up across or onto the grasses and help stretch the grasses out because they do get a lot thinner at the top. And the only way of handling that is to push it out with a palette knife, unless you have a really thin, I don't know, I don't think a tortillon would work. A very sharp pastel pencil could do the same thing. I also find that I'll actually take a charcoal pencil if I've got something reasonably dark and draw, and it could be very well a thin branch against a bright sky, using a bit of a charcoal pencil for that. But again, very lightly. The color itself, or the charcoal, or if you're using a pencil, will show, will actually, the pencil will actually reflect with the graphite on the surface, and you don't really want that. Although there are pastels that have specks of light in them, sparkles. I've got a pink sparkle pastel. I think I have a one with blue sparkles. I got a white sparkle one. It's called um, I think it's called Wave Crest or something like that. Um, White water, and I've used that in my water my waterscapes. Here I'm working on that um, building that distance to the row on the right. We know that it ends back there somewhere, so I had to build some sense of depth and distance. I used more moderate or mid values on the back, and a little bit of highlight too, to create that sense that there is that the row goes toward the tree line in the back. So keep thinking about, as you look at this painting, how I've worked on drawing the viewer toward that center, toward that focal point. With be it the direction of the lines, even that those highlights that I just added, kind of they angle downward toward the focal point. As I mentioned before, with all the lights in here, I'll continue to bring in some darks to build the contrast. Again, we're doing some more of this here to build contrast against the lighter grasses. This is again that deep blue pastel, and got to get some of that shaping up around the grasses in the back to indicate that there are horizontal grasses lying on the ground on the pathway. Do some a little bit of blending with the palette knife to soften the impact just a bit. But I kind of like playing around with the contrasts like this, and this is something that it doesn't come to you until you've done a fair amount of the painting itself, and conveyed some of those highlights already, and then you kind of want to rework it, not rework it, but kind of keep building on that concept. The grasses tend to be kind of funny at this point because they can't be too thick at the edges. They've got to feather out in some sense. So Tortillon helped here to kind of darken a bit some of the edges, and we need to be careful not to not to show real strong grasses against the distance because they would, with the thinness, kind of blend in, if you will, into the in this case the distant tree line. We'll work some of those gaps. We have what we call sky holes in trees, so there'd be sky holes here behind the grasses. Some of those we could work in by bringing some of the background green, dark green, again using the long end of a vertical edge of a vertical stroke of a pastel behind the grasses to help build some of that, some of those sky holes, if you will. This is again that light orange pastel, softening up the edges of just a bit up against the dark background. This is the one of the lightest pastels that I have. That I believe it's also the same pastel I used up in the clouds. Again, it's talking about using the same pastel, same color, same value in certain spots of the painting to help build contrast again at that very bright spot near the focal point. So I'll get out about 2 or 3 times a week with my camera, weather permitting, of course, to find opportunities to photograph. Here, again, I'm using a very bright pastel. At this point, you kind of work a little bit here and there, some of the greater highlights of the painting. And you'll notice that a lot of the strokes that I'm doing now are small, or they seem to be very minor touches. But just to think, I'd gone back, I'd looked at the painting again, I stepped away, looked at it from the other end of the room. You also could take a mirror and get the painting in the mirror, and you're looking at it in its reverse, and that helps too to help you review the composition and how you got the lighting and all that. And I've made changes in paintings after looking at them in the mirror and wanting to change something here and there, which can be done. Here, the light is a little less intense in terms of the reflection, so we're muting that blue just a bit. But also continuing to add some more highlights near the focal point. So I'll take photographs and bring them back to the studio. We'll review them, and what I'll do is when I pick out the ones that I want to create a painting for, then I'll take notes about what I want to do with the painting. Certainly, I'll sketch it first. I'll do a very simple sketch composition. I'll do a notan. I'll do a value sketch, typically using charcoal. Sometimes I'll do a small version of the painting in pastel, which I did in this particular case, and then I'll decide what I want to do. If there's going to be an underpainting, what it'll be. Typically, it's acrylic. What will the colors be in that underpainting? I of course have figured out already what is it that I want to say about this painting, or why am I doing this painting? Why am I painting this scene? I've already answered those questions. So then I'll look at the composition and say, what can I create here that goes along the lines of of getting the viewer to focus in on the focal point, but also playing with light and lighting to enhance that viewer's attention and to enhance the painting and make it more interesting. So I'll take notes on the particular painting, and I'll look at it, I'll photograph it, and I'll look at it later on that day, and I'll take more notes so that next time I go to the studio, to work on the painting. I've got my game plan and my work cut out for me. I've got my list of tasks to pursue, and and that's how you could kind of remain pretty efficient in doing a painting, and recognizing also when you just need to stop for the day. That if you've kind of done enough, you could be creating a really nice painting, but after a while of working on it, you could not like it so much. And it's not that it's not a not it's not that it's a bad painting, but that you're just getting tired of it and trying to either go on to something else or just take a break from it. And often what I do is I would just start another painting and put it aside, and I could work a couple paintings at once. So here I'm just continuing to work the highlights and honing them into the focal area with lines of glowing sunlight on these grasses. Pastels I use are I've got Rembrandt's, Unison's, Great American Artworks, um, Townsend, and probably a little bit of everything. Senneliers. I've got some Schminkies, which are very soft. Notice now the path is a little more defined, especially on the right side. I brought some more of the blue water, the reflected sky reflected water out that way, and it helped to define the base of the grasses as they proceed toward the distant tree line. For probably a good part of this painting, the grasses just on the right side just stopped abruptly. Now the grasses on the left, you can't see the distance there, so they're kind of covering up the row that's behind them. But on the right, we're at such an angle with this perspective of the reference photo that those grasses do continue along the path back there. So, so we're going to start do a little more work on defining those grasses and that perspective back there. I just can't seem to leave alone the grasses in the front. So continuing to build some of those. Um, really, it's a variety of highlights too. It's not straight bunch of bright lines. It's the speckles here and there. I really liked the orange that I'd done on this little island area here in the water, so I want to emphasize that a little bit more, and a little bit of the more of the glow that was from the grasses and the sunlight. Just little spots here and there of a mid value, kind of an orange, just convey different foliage, or the grasses and the other bumps, etc., that are there. This is a mid-value pastel. I'm applying it to the shaded area of the grasses to indicate the fact that there are grasses back there. This is a lighter purple, and it's a hard old new pastel. So when I continue the row on the right, I'll bring a little bit of a highlight toward the back of it, picking up some sunlight toward the back. But here I'm kind of blending these a bit with the tortillon. They're so they show a little bit of different value here, but they're not really strong. They're in the shade. They're not really clear what they are, but you know there's something back there. So that was the impact there. Here on the grasses now, I'll pull those out to the right a bit toward the end of the row. And this is a deeper value color. It's not as bright, certainly as bright as the bright orange yellows, bright oranges that we see in the front. Um, so you need to make it a bit duller, if you will, for that distant area. It's taking my good old blue and emphasizing that a bit for impact. So even though as I mentioned, the tree line's got that little deep blue acrylic showing on the pastel surface. There's no pastel on it. I decided it was still an unfinished portion of the painting. So what I'm going to do is spend a little time on fixing that section up while I apply some of the, or before though, I'm going to continue applying some of the highlights. Again, there's that line thing, kind of create a line of light. And I think it comes together pretty nicely on the right side of the grasses as well as on the left. So on the sky itself, so again, the bottom of the clouds are a grayish purple. So I've got to get that in there on top of the, or right behind the grasses. So that's what I'm doing here. This is again overlaying that deep blue alizarin crimson acrylic to complete that part of the painting. So we'll continue with the clouds and some of the greens that are on that tree line in the background. So this is a deep green, a very deep yellow green um, pastel, and this is where some of the sky holes come into play because some of that shows behind the grasses. Applying some of the highlights to those clouds, and notice how I'm bringing the highlights toward the right end of that cloud bank, and I'll match that up with the bright part of the grasses on the right side, blending that in as we did before to wrap up the sky and the clouds. This is another similar dark green pastel to emphasize the edge of the tree line with the sky. Now, at some point, you could decide just to stop, and it's we'll call it the artist's preference, or someone's preference, or what's your preference for the painting. That there's some changes that you just don't need to make once the painting you believe is technically accurate, and that's like the drawing, the what you wanted to cover. And by the way, I'm working in that little curved section in here where we saw some of the acrylic protruding from the pastel surface to kind of blend that in just a little bit. But I kind of liked what it looked like at the end, so I pretty much left it alone. So I'm kind of drawing the focal point a little bit further up into the pathway where the water is reflecting the sky. So you want your paintings to be technically correct, right? Now we'll call them errors or whatever they are, and it could be something related to the composition. It could be um, certain values that aren't quite right. So you want to kind of your drawing might be there might be an issue on drawing or accuracy of the drawing or lack thereof. So those you want to look at. So you want to get those taken care of. But then after that, by making a lot of these changes are I like them for the effect that they create, but some of it's just a personal preference. You don't have to do this, you don't have to do that, but it might be a nice to have, so you might want to do it. So a little more dark at the tops of the grasses with some of those darker orange pastels and pastel pencils that I have. I didn't want the grasses to stop at the tree line, so we kind of go over that tree line a bit. That's actually something technical that you want to do. You don't want the tips of the grasses to correspond with the tips to the top of the tree line. You know that they're going to protrude above it or be short of it. And you also have some of the sky holes behind the grasses that reflect that dark green tree line. This is a small blue pastel pencil I like to use for darker areas. As I was doing this part, I realized that the path itself needs an edge. The edge of the pathway where it meets that tree line in the distance. So I took a look at that. Again, I stood back and looked at this, and it kind of looked like the pathway kind of just merges into the tree line in the distance. So I had to build some delineation there. So that's what I'm doing here, working up slightly lighter value for the path. The tree line was a darker value, a slightly darker value. It didn't quite look like that in the reference photo, but recognizing that upright structures of a tree line, for example, that doesn't have direct sunlight is going to be a little bit darker, or somewhat darker than the flat ground picking up the light. So here's my little yellowish green, dark yellow green soft pastel I'm using to help build again that separation of the path with the edge of the tree line, bringing in that dark, deep blue pastel to also help emphasize the tree line portion of that delineation. Here we go. So really getting to the point of making some of the final touches of this painting. And at this point, I talked about an arc of light coming from the right edge of the clouds. You see that bright spot at the right edge of the clouds that hit the tops. Here, I'm going to do this arc in here, and you can see this pencil is doing most of the work. It's kind of lightening up a swath of the grasses corresponding to the edge, just about to the edge of the light cloud. And I'll bring that down, but I'm feathering it in because I want it to be more of an aura, not really that strong, but certainly giving it some luminous dimension by bringing it along down and then down to the left. And it kind of indicates it could be like glow from the sun, tips of grasses again, and meeting up with the row of lighter grasses that I built on the lower right side here. This is where you kind of have fun with some of the effects in a painting, but you can only really get here, in my opinion, until you're toward the end of the painting, when you want to make some last minute impacts. The grasses here on the left were kind of broken up a bit with light, so I tried to combine them or merge them a bit, so it was a little more of a smoother light impact. Those grasses and bringing them out a little bit further into that dark portion of that dark area of the foreground in front of the grasses. Little more highlights to some more highlights to the clouds. Unfortunately, you can't see what I'm doing here, but my hand's in the way. I have to figure out how to avoid that next time. But I'm still adding some highlights to the clouds here and feathering the tops of the grasses a bit. A little more emphasis at the tops of the grasses and meeting up actually in this particular these particular pastel strokes with the edge of the cloud bank. Here's where I expanded the cloud bank up to the upper left of the canvas, the surface, and the intent here was to create an angle coming from the upper left down slightly to the right. It's not just a flat tree line, cloud line. The cloud bank actually in the photograph is pretty flat or horizontal. But I wanted to angle this one too. And again, it's opposite the angle of the both the distant tree line as well as the grasses, the two sets of tall grasses. So notice how it's opposite those. The parallel line is the top part of the reflected water is pretty much parallel to the cloud bank, and the lower section of the reflected water is converging. So, and then again, on top of all that, you've got these streaks of light rows and emphasis highlights along within the stalks of grasses, and then on the grasses in the foreground on the lower right. So that is the play of light in this particular painting. A few more highlights on the water, but taking the sunlight and having it spotlight certain areas and create composition using light as composition in portions of this painting. All in my opinion, kind of comes together very nicely, and it's just an interesting scene for somewhat of a complicated subject matter for a landscape painting. Can't give up applying those blues near those oranges. And those are sort of sky holes or water holes, if you will, behind the grasses in the foreground. And that's pretty much that is the painting. So here's the final version of Painting the Way. Email me with any questions, or if you'd like the reference photo and paint along yourself, you can visit my website and follow me on Instagram. Thanks very much for spending the time with us today, and have a good day.